Tessa has a question
Hello,
about
Tessa.
Romans 11. What is the olive
Oh,
tree
wow.
all about?
The
What is the
olive.
olive tree all about, and all the stuff about the hardening of hearts? It's very confusing. It also seems
Wow.
like God is doing a lot of branch cutting and a lot of grafting and a
Yeah.
lot of hardening of hearts. And
And then he
what is
says at
that?
the end, in like around verse 30 or right around 31 maybe, but in the end, all of Israel will be saved.
Hmm.
So what? So okay. So the dynamic here, and man, this is you dissertations have been written on this because Romans 9 through 11 is a real challenging portion of Scripture by anyone's standards, but it makes it even more challenging now because there's been a long tradition of interpreting it a particular way, which I think has been not helpful. The dynamic that Paul's dealing with is that Israel is supposed to be God's covenant people, right? Jesus comes and he is the Messiah, and yet the majority of the covenant people don't acknowledge him. And so Paul is now wondering, like, okay, does that mean that God has revoked his promises to have Israel as God's chosen people? What he basically argues is that God's chosen people have always been a people by faith. And then he says that the true Jew has always been one who walks by faith, not by works, which is very different from what many Jews understood their faith to be at the time of Jesus, because they thought that it's obedience to the law that qualifies you to be considered God's people. So he wants to answer this question, and he does it by distinguishing between the true Jew and the nationalistic Jew. The true Jew, which is just called people of God, are those who walk by faith. That's the conclusion he draws at the end of Romans 9. But then he likens us Gentiles. He's saying, okay, now you Gentiles, very quickly the church became primarily Gentile by the time you get to the second century. But he's saying, you Gentiles, don't you get haughty, don't you get proud, certainly don't get anti-Semitic, which was present at the time of Jesus, because you've been grafted in. So he's using this analogy of Israel as this olive tree, and now you've been grafted in. You become part of the olive tree. But the branches that weren't bearing fruit, they get cut off. And then he says of those who are cut off, they're now being hardened. And he says that in Romans 9, 10, and 11. So it comes up several places. That's where some folks, because of the reading of Romans 9, where what if God wants to show mercy on whom he wants to have mercy and harden whomever he wants, they think that God hardens people, and that's why they become unfruitful, and that's why they get cut off. But Paul says explicitly in Romans 11, I think it's verse 6 or 7, that they were cut off because of their unbelief. So God's cutting off the hardening was not the cause of the cutting off. The cutting off was the cause of the hardening. Given that you're going to be this way, then you'll be hardened in that direction. Now, the hardening thing goes back to the potter clay analogy, where Paul says, what if God out of one lump of clay wants to make some merciful vessels and some that are just for menial use, and then he punishes those that are for menial use or common use, so that the righteous clay figures can feel grateful that it didn't happen to them, which is, I think, a twisted. If our child did that, if you caught your son playing with clay and then making certain righteous figures and unrighteous figures and then smashing eternally the unrighteous and then turning to the righteous saying, oh, aren't you glad I didn't do that to you? You'd get your kid into a therapist pretty quick, I would think, because that's just
Totally.
that breaks every ethical norm that we could possibly have. What he's doing there is he's appealing back to Jeremiah 18, where the potter clay analogy is not used to say I can form whatever I want. It's used to say that the potter, who's God, always fashions the right kind of vessel depending on the clay, what kind of clay he has to work with. He shows them this potter working with this stubborn clay, and the vessel he wanted to create, the bowl he wanted to create, wasn't possible because the clay wasn't pliant. So he then devised a different kind of gold, different kind of vessel, because that's the only thing you can create with this kind of clay. So he's saying, the point of Romans 9, it comes back in the loop in Romans 11, is be pliable in the hands of God, and let him fashion what he wants to fashion. Don't be hard, because if you're hardened, then he'll make you into a hardened vessel. God always does the appropriate thing based on what people do. And so if you have faith, boom, you're in this trajectory. God's going to form you into being a Jesus lookalike. If you're in unbelief, still trying to do it by works, still trying to base on your nationality or trying to get life from the rightness of your views or whatever, well, now you're not being pliable. You're in unbelief, and God's going to have to fashion you differently for that. He still will use you for his own purposes like he did Pharaoh, but it won't benefit you at all. And so here Paul is saying, everybody, Jew and Gentile, he's concluded all to be under sin, that he might have mercy upon all. That's always God's goal. But we can be hardened and we can be resistant. The Jews did it, which is why it opened up to the Gentiles. And Gentiles, if you also get hardened, well, the same thing will happen to you. So the whole point is to collapse down the racial categories and to define the people of God as the people of faith. And I suspect, but I'm not positive, that when Paul says all Israel will be saved, what he means there is all the true Israel will be saved. He calls the church in Galatians 6. He says that the church is the Israel of God. And so I think all of God's elect, all those who have by their own choice put themselves into the stream of God's election, God's people, God's covenant people, will be saved. It's possible he means all of Israel will somehow be saved, because it's possible that Paul believes all people will in the end be saved. That's the universalist position, and a strong case can be made for it, but a strong case can be made against it. I'm more persuaded by that right now than I am of the case for it. At the very least, the warning passages have to mean something very significant, because in the New Testament, those warnings are very significant. Like don't, that way is towards destruction. It may be that destruction is not the last word. It may be that God will work with you until you get in. But that doesn't make the destruction, it makes it less permanent, but it doesn't make it more pleasant. It's meant to be, it's like, if you reject the God of life, you're choosing death, and it's terrible. Don't go down that way. So I really feel compelled to emphasize that in proportion to the degree that's emphasized in the New Testament.
Yeah. When I read, and I don't read Romans 11 a lot, but when I saw this question, I'm like, well, I got to go look at that again. And what I came away with just like, I thought it was really hopeful. The whole chapter I thought was hopeful, because here you have God grafting in these people who were not part of his original community. And at the same time, the fact that God is just grafting people in, it can kind of seem like, oh, well, then, it doesn't really matter what I do because God is just going to graft me in. Well,
Right.
no, because he also cuts people off, and what
Right.
we do still matters, like in a very serious way. There's danger in these waters. You have to take this seriously, but at the
Right.
same time, even though there's danger, there's no reason for hopelessness, because here we have a God who's obviously doing everything that God can to make sure that anybody who wants to be part of this olive tree is going to be part of the olive tree. Anybody who wants to be on this boat going down this stream, you're going to be on the boat. And but you still have to take it seriously. So you have both. You have this importance and also this hope. And it's such a beautiful chapter.
That hope, I think, is most succinctly and powerfully expressed when Paul says that God has consigned all to be under sin, that he might have mercy upon all. And I'll tell you, Dan, that verse has ministered a lot of peace to me, because it seems like no matter how much God gives his people to work with, we still screw it up. So throughout the history of Israel says that, but the history of the church also says that. What a monumental failure, statistically speaking, this has been. You think of all the harm and the evil that have been done by Christians, the opposite of what Jesus told us to do. He says, love your enemies. Well, no, we'd rather cut off their heads and burn them alive. So it makes you wonder, like, what were you thinking, God? I mean, it's why would you entrust human beings with this? Why include us at all? Because all we do is screw it up. Well, it includes us because that's what we were created for. And the fact that we are all under sin and in bondage to sin, God makes that very clear to us so that he can have mercy on us. So it's a call. Yes, there's hope here, but only if you are aware of God's grace, only if you're aware of God's mercy and your need for mercy. Your hope is not found when you stop trying to get your own righteousness and rather just say, God, I stand by grace. And that grace is transforming. So it's not the kind of grace where you say, I stand by grace, therefore I can sin all I want. No, I stand by grace, and that's why I'm being transformed from the inside out.
Yeah.
And God, it shows you God would love to have mercy on all. Universalists say, well, God will get his wish. I'm not there yet, but I hope they're right.
Me too.
But in the meantime, take this seriously and stand in God's mercy.